Continuing to catch up on the devotionals, I'm a little bit behind on. This devotional is for Thursday. It was March the 30th, 2023. The title of the devotional, The Distinction Between the Clean and Unclean. Now, our scripture reading that this devotional will cover is Leviticus chapter 11 and chapter 12. Now, notice with me in Leviticus chapter 11, we have the distinction between the clean and unclean meats. Now, Leviticus 11 then distinguished between the meats deemed clean and consumable and the unclean, which the Lord commanded were unfit for consumption. He, therefore, the Lord, instructed Moses and Aaron regarding the beasts of the children of Israel could eat and those they were forbidden to eat in Leviticus chapter 11. Now, while the heathen would eat all manner of flesh, the children of Israel were to limit their diet to what the Lord judged were clean. Large beasts that were cloven-footed and cheweth the cud, chapter 11 and verse 3, and therefore included the ox, cattle, sheep, goat, and deer. Now, there were beasts also that the Lord described as unclean, and they did not chew the cud. Others did not divide the hoof, chapter 11 and verses 4 through 8. Now, examples of forbidden beasts would have been, in verse 4, the camel. In verse 5, the coney, which is believed to be like a rock badger. And then in verse 6, the hare, which is similar to a rabbit. And then, of course, in verse 7, we also have the swine, that is a pig or a boar. Though he divide the hoof, we read, and is cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud. The swine, is unclean to you. Now also in verse 9, fish with fins and scales were permitted for consumption. However, any creature of the water that lacked fish and scales was considered an abomination in verse 11 and 12, therefore not allowed. Then we have the Hebrew word fowl, describing anything winged that flew. For instance, in verses 13 through 19, there are numerous predatory fowl and scavengers of carrion, we would refer to vultures, that are labeled unclean and forbidden for ingestion. Leviticus 11 and verse 20 also describes fowls that creep, going upon all four, believed to be a reference to winged insects like flies, wasps, and bees. Now, notice also in Leviticus 11 and verse 21, we have that there were some swarming winged insects that were permitted in the Hebrew diet, and they are described as, and I'm going to quote verse 21, as every flying, creeping thing that goeth upon all four, which have legs above their feet to leap withal upon the earth. Now, these insects have jointed legs, and their larger hind legs allow them to leap. Among those that may be eaten were locusts, beetles, and grasshoppers, as you read chapter 11 and verses 22 through 24. Now, also verse 24 through 25, we read that all beasts, clean or unclean, that died as the course of nature or by violence were not to be eaten. We would say you're not allowed to eat, quote, roadkill, for instance. So, also, horses, asses, that is donkeys, dogs, and all other beasts with paws, lions, and tigers were all deemed unclean and were not to be consumed. And then touching them, even those beasts that were proclaimed unclean, would make one ceremonially unclean. Now, other animals labeled as, verse 29 through 30, creeping things that creep upon the earth, were forbidden for human consumption. Among those would have been the weasel, the mouse, mice, tortoise, after his kind, the ferret, the chameleon, the lizard, the snail, and the mole. All were forbidden. Then notice, if you would, Leviticus 11 to verse 32 through 36. Even if kitchen vessels, that is pots and pans, back then made of clay, some maybe later made of metal, that came in contact with unclean animals were declared unclean. Also, vessels of wood, raiment, skin that came in contact with unclean animals were to be cleaned in water and not used until that evening. Okay, then vessels of clay that came in contact with unclean beasts were to be broken and discarded. And then added 41 through 43, snakes that slithered on their belly were unclean. Now, we would ask the question, why such attention to dietary restrictions? Well, you can read verses 44 through 45 to find the reason. There were several reasons that are cited by the Lord's declaration and distinction between clean and unclean beasts. Now, before men could peer through microscopes and see the prevalence of dangerous bacterium in meats, the Creator, God, knew those meats that were harmful to man. And so to prevent the consumption of meats that caused illness, disease, and death, the Lord simply declared them unclean. Now, the Lord also, you'll read as you look at 44 through 45, the Lord, who also is himself holy, commanded the same of his people. In fact, we read in verse 44 and 45, sanctify yourselves and see, and ye shall be holy, for I am holy. And then Leviticus chapter 12, briefly, we have this passage regarding the purification of women. Now, Leviticus 12 then moves us, the focus from unclean beasts to unclean persons, and instructed women regarding ceremonial purification following childbirth. Now, you'll find in verses 1 through 2 then that a woman who had given birth was considered ceremonially unclean. She was to be separated from the sanctuary until her days of purification were past. So the question would be, how many days must pass before the woman who had given birth, a mother, would be deemed clean? Well, that example is given regarding giving birth of a son. Giving birth of a son, the woman would be deemed ceremonially unclean. That is, judged ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Now, during that time, she and her son would be separated from the family. Verse 2, on the 8th day, she would take her son to the priest to be circumcised. Her days of purification then were numbered 33 days, during which time she remained at home, according to verse 4. Now, a woman who gave birth to a daughter in verse 5 was also separated from her family and considered unclean for 2 weeks. Now, she remained at home for 66 days for her purification. Now, when a mother's days of purification and isolation were fulfilled, she came to the sanctuary, dependent upon her means, and she brought an offering. Verse 6, a lamb of the first year for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon, or a turtle dove for a sin offering, unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation unto the priest. Now, looking at verse 7 through 8, the sin offering was a confession of her unworthiness. The burnt offering was the sacrifice of gratitude and thanksgiving, acknowledging God's mercies in bringing her through the pangs of childbirth. Now, I invite you to go to heartofashepherd.com, and there you'll find 4 questions to consider as you study today's passage. Thank you for joining me for this Heart of a Shepherd daily devotion. Bye-bye.